everyone. Thanks for joining us. We are now sort of towards the end of the second week of COP27, and I'm here with Jennifer Layke from WRI. I'm Amit Bando, Chief Economist and Senior Advisor on Just and Inclusive Economics at Ceres. And I just thought that would be a good idea to have a little chat with Jennifer on what we are seeing here at COP, and given our particular perspectives, looking at the energy sector and the financing and advances or progress that we're making towards net zero would be something that would be nice to talk about. So Jennifer, as we look around, as we walk the hallways here, so to speak, talk to different people, what are your impressions? What are you seeing here that impresses you as being something that you had expected and are pleasantly surprised that things are happening? What are some surprises? And within that, are there things that you think we are still missing?
Thank you, Amit. It's wonderful to be here with you. Here we are with only a few days left and negotiations well underway. So it's a good moment to pause and talk a little bit about where we are. The clean energy conversation has been everywhere at this COP, and it's not surprising. We're in the midst of an energy crisis, significant, challenging circumstances for most of the world in terms of thinking about where and how you roll out renewable energy in a period where supply chains are constrained and where finance is uncertain. $100 billion that was promised has not been delivered through the UNFCCC's processes. And there's a sense of anxiety about how fast we're going. We released the State of Climate Action report just a few weeks ago, in which we found that we still need to be 6 times faster in deploying our renewable energy. But on the positive side, we saw this week a JETP for Indonesia, right? The Just Energy Transition Partnership platform. South Africa was first one out last year, $8.5 billion. And there's now an investment plan associated with that. Within 1 year, there's been a series of principles for participation that the Presidential Commission on Climate for South Africa has put forward, this investment plan, and the $8.5 billion is now going to have to materialize and be programmed. And now with the next JETP, which is this Indonesia one, it's $20 billion, the details of which we don't have yet, but some combination of private money, we're told, matching public investment at interest rates that are equivalent to the best of the markets out there, as opposed to many developing countries that have much higher interest rates as a result of the perceived risks.
And would you say that these are good examples of where we're trying to put essentially a down payment, and we're trying to create a framework for additional flows? And it's a combination of public and private money, in some instances domestic as well as international funds could be used towards this. And I wonder if, stepping back a little bit, we could tie some of this activity to our own IRA and the related incentives, if you may, and the formulation of the structure such that monies flow. Any thoughts on whether you see some linkages there?
Yeah, I think the IRA is an example of an incredibly important and ambitious domestic fiscal policy. It is an industrial policy. It is a transportation policy. It is a transition policy. And the reality of how it gets implemented is what we're all watching to see. How quickly can the money move through Department of Energy, through EPA, the $39 billion greenhouse gas fund that EPA will be establishing. And there's a very important opportunity for the private sector to dramatically scale and its investment in the kinds of equipment upgrades, new approaches to their fleet and electrification. And if we can pull that in through these incentives, we have a capital stock turnover that could really dramatically change our trajectory. And not only that, I think this is one of the things that the administration has been talking about. It also then drives the price down. It helps bring these products to market, heat pump technologies, others, where we know that the applications are also going to be supported elsewhere in the world. I mean, Europe today could use the heat pumps that we may be producing as a result of these kinds of incentives.
So given that today is Solutions Day, the theme here is solutions, do you see some of these as being the right kinds of solutions? And let's assume that they are. Are there others that we ought to be focusing on? What are other countries saying when it comes to that?
I think the one area where we have had a lot of challenging conversations is in the area of natural gas. To what extent has the energy crisis currently and the immediate response that the world has put forward in terms of moving as much capacity for LNG to get to Europe, that has had implications on the rest of the world. Asia's natural gas supply, LNG supply coming from the US and elsewhere has been constrained. And so really this question of where and how the economy transitions has become front and center. And in the other piece that's coming from many countries is if we're not doing natural gas, how close are we to hydrogen? Really, is there a hydrogen solution for industrial energy use that would allow them to bypass the idea of gas? And or if you have a lot of renewables, can you, instead of thinking about exploiting your domestic natural gas reserves, can you use your renewables to create hydrogen, to export that for a revenue stream? I think those are really important questions, but not easy ones because, of course, the technology on hydrogen is still unproven.
So in this discussion, do you think some countries are further ahead in terms of having a pathway that's better defined than others?
Well, there's a lot of work going on pathways right now. You look at India and creating its green hydrogen mission. You look at the JETP in South Africa, very significant view of how green hydrogen could support the economy there. Namibia made an announcement this week about its investments in green hydrogen, and the United States has its green hydrogen hubs. So those are going to be, there's a kind of a race for the next, for decarbonization solutions, and those are going to be an industry. We know light-duty vehicles can go electric around the world. We do have to deal with supply chain and minerals, but we are getting there. We know that we can get most of our power already from renewable electricity if we get the infrastructure right. Now we have to focus on these hard-to-abate sectors, what we call, and heavy industry.
And in this context, where and what kinds of actions do you see the private sector stepping in with?
Well, one of the most powerful levers that I've ever seen in terms of getting technology is business to business. There's both a role for supply chain pull, right? We're asking suppliers to look at the carbon performance of the products that they're selling into the market. And then there's also the kind of opportunities for metrics around procurement. I started my career in 2001 at World Resources Institute looking at renewable electricity procurement. And in that context, it was an amazing opportunity. A kilowatt hour is a kilowatt hour is a kilowatt hour. Now we have to be thinking about it in more defined ways about the attributes of performance. Those are a little bit more complicated, but if we can get cement, steel, the business-to-business conversation around the carbon performance of those goods alongside their other attributes, we could really unlock the procurement as a driver for these new green products. The other piece of this is, of course, investors. and how investors start looking at and evaluating new technologies, and whether they're recognizing the role that they can play and how they play a role in the risk return conversation for the short term and the long term.
So, probing that a little bit more, as you say, it's important moving forward to look at the different attributes and not just look at a single attribute, but sort of the co-benefits, if you may. But that also requires evaluation of the business case, looking at the risk-reward ratios differently. Do you think we're at a point where investors and the banks and, say, the builders of these infrastructure, are they all talking the same language, using similar parameters, using similar sort of measures and metrics, if you may? Or?
Well, I would love to hear Ceres' impression about that, and if you could tell us a little bit more how you're seeing it. I think that I am seeing that there are pockets of real interest in that, in looking at new methodologies and looking at new metrics, but that hasn't created the broader linked action that we're going to need. So one of the things that, I released this week a roadmap for solar investment called Our Solar Future. And over and over again, as we were consulting with the experts around the world on solar programming, there was a sense that the perceptions of risk are not equivalent, and that certain technologies and certain countries are perceived differently, whether or not there is a proof behind the risk levels. But that if we could bundle things together, you can de-risk these things from any one individual project to a whole class of projects or program, and create a more level risk evaluation.
No, I agree with you. That's very similar to what we're finding, is that in fact, as you say, bundling leads to increased sort of de-risking, if you may. But at the same time, I think, depending on whose perspective you take, there's a different perception. The same set of activities, the same attributes will be viewed differently depending on where people are looking at it from. And this is happening, this is true in the domestic situation, but gets even more complicated when we go and compare across different geographies.
Yeah, one stark statistic that I heard this week on that point is, last year in 2021, Bloomberg New Energy Finance said that there was an 11-year low in renewable energy investment into Africa. And that's 0.6% of all global clean energy investment went to Africa. And what that says to me is that it's not the technology that's holding us back; it's the structures and the mechanisms that we lack in terms of getting to scale and speed and getting those projects developed.
So, just picking on that, do you think it's a result of investors or people in the financial community actually seeing that in the past they have not performed, their investments haven't performed so well, or is it an added perception that things have gotten riskier and hence we shouldn't be putting money in? What?
I think it's a little bit of both.
Okay.
I do think we talked a lot over the last few years about the performance of utilities, and certainly for national utilities, there has been a significant set of challenges associated with their performance and their ability for them to repay loans. They're very indebted. Consumers in many parts of the world have many lower income consumers, and so they're served at a loss, which is, from a social perspective, absolutely understandable. But from then the financial perspective, makes it hard for those utilities to go out and get additional capital.
So given that we billed this COP as the action COP, do you see that there are certain actions that have been identified, or are you looking at this and saying, well, as a result of what we're seeing here, there's going to be some concrete action?
Yeah, there are a lot of pledges that came in Glasgow, and I think there's been a lot of criticism as well about we haven't moved that money. But we do have to recognize that this is happening in the context of a significant amount of change. Institutional change does take time. There's a focus on reforming the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, the institutions that are development institutions first and foremost. And then there's new commitments that are being made by, like, the CIF, the Climate Investment Funds. There's a whole, I think, effort to try to align, and the question is going to be whether or not those the inertia in the institutions and the transaction costs and transaction time of those institutions simply is too slow.
So are you seeing some skepticism around that? The fact that, as you talk to people, particularly those from the most vulnerable communities and countries that are sort of bearing the brunt of the problems, are you seeing some skepticism that the pace at which we are moving, as you say, there are institutional issues, there are structural issues that take time, but there's a sense of impatience, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen that come through, and it rears itself in multiple ways, right? I mean, this week, much of the conversation has been on the loss and damages, and the loss and damages as the need for us as a global community to recognize that those that are experiencing the biggest losses are not those who contributed to the problem. It was exciting for me to see, for example, that the G7 and the V20 announced the Global Shield this week. That was something that bundles activities to provide rapid response in times of climate-related damage and emergencies, but it doesn't go far enough, right? It's a drop in the bucket, and we need a more structural, institutional agreement in order to manage for the loss and damages.
And what's your sense in that? Because I think there's a lot of discussion around loss and damage, but yet it seems to me that there's quite a clear distinction in terms of what we mean by loss and damage. I think most developed countries, US included, would say, yes, loss and damage is already included. If you talk about the fact that in the future, whatever loss and damage there is, we're going to address those through adaptation, resilience, whereas I think there's a sense amongst a vast majority of other countries that say we need to go back and look at past loss and damage. And where do we stand? Are we sort of getting some convergence in thinking during the discussions here, or is it too early to tell?
I think it's too early to tell. We have a lot of work to do on this. This is just not going to be an easy process to negotiate through. But I am very pleased that at this COP there has been a significant focus on it. I also think that adaptation and resilience have come to the fore, and in some ways those can be the angle that allow us to manage the need for us to take a huge loss and damage position if we can really double down on the adaptation and resilience over time. We minimize the loss and damages.
Yeah, I agree with you that there is a very clear focus on adaptation and resilience at this COP that was probably not as evident before this. And so, question, were you surprised by that, or were you anticipating that we would be moving in this direction?
I think it was only a matter of time before we all had to move in this direction. The mitigation agenda, it doesn't take us far enough. The estimates of where we are in terms of temperature change, it is not aligned with 1.5 degrees today. So that means we have to be investing in these other areas of work in terms of adaptation and resiliency, even as we continue to try to get the energy system transitioned as fast as possible and create new economies, circular economies that will allow us to use fewer resources and to reuse the resources and to improve the economic productivity.
So that's a good segue into what I wanted to ask you, which is, given your particular perspective, you've worked in the energy area for so long, and we can look at energy systems, we can look at the built environment, we can look at urban planning, all of which have energy components. Where do you see that going with this emphasis, if you may, or renewed emphasis and acceptance that at some level we have to talk about adaptation and resilience, and 1.5 degrees still great target, but how do we adapt to that or something around that?
Well, even today, right, we're not at 1.5, thank goodness, we're still below that level, but even today.
But even at 1.2, we have a lot of adaptation and resilience, right? So any thoughts as to what you're seeing? I'm particularly interested in sort of the built environment, the urban environment, knowing that moving forward, so much of humanity is going to be living primarily in urban, environments, with 8 billion already people on the planet as of November 15, and increasingly they're going to be living in urban settings. So, any thoughts on what you see the focus would be on adaptation, resilience within the energy use and supply context?
Yeah, I had a colleague who said to me the other day, we have the opportunity to change the way people who are considering their options on energy think, and you're in the future, and that future may be 2 years, maybe 5 years, maybe 15 years, but in the future you will have your own energy because it'll be your battery in your vehicle or in your motorcycle, or whatever vehicle you may use. You'll have a mobile energy source and energy supply. And I think that vision is quite compelling, that you would have the ability to plug in anywhere you go, and that you need to have the ability to island yourself, your system from the grid. But our grids aren't designed for that today.
Right.
And the challenge we're facing is that most cities are not in control of their energy infrastructure. They can be in charge of the charging infrastructure that they put in place in buildings, and the buildings and the codes to allow that interconnectivity of demand response, of being able to do islanding in case of an emergency, of that infrastructure. But it will require us to have an alignment between the utility planning process and the urban planning process that we don't have in most places today. Cities are not stakeholders in energy planning in most places. I think that has to change, just as I think we need to look at the infrastructure investments from the national level to the city level and make sure that we're aligning those to get to net zero.
Right, so you're trying to say, essentially capture a future where we have modular, off-grid, mini-grid kind of solutions, if you may. At the same time, you are talking about certain changes in the policy and even the political system, whereby control is decentralized and sub-nationalized down to the city?
Yeah, I mean, it may be that so we've worked with cities in the United States, for example, as the utilities do their integrated resource plans. The cities can become stakeholders, can provide input to the utility. Our targets are first 80% renewables by 2030. If those are the kinds of goals that the city has, that needs a mechanism for being integrated into the planning. I think often what we have is a regulatory structure at the state or the national level that dictates what investments go forward without understanding what the demand side activities may look like in that period.
Okay, so the integration is important. And speaking of that, how do you see energy supply and demand being integrated with some of the other needs like water and food, often provision of clean potable water requires a lot of energy. So energy efficiency starts playing a part, certainly in production of food. Where do you see the trends there? And was there some discussion about that nexus and solutions here at the COP?
Yeah, the water energy link is an incredibly important connection. And it is going to be something where we're going to see a lot more potential conflict over time, political conflict, geopolitical conflicts. The two things that I was struck by, and first I spent about 5 years working in a private ESCO, and one of the things that was remarkable to me was that as we talked about the infrastructure and energy needing to be upgraded and buildings needing to be upgraded, the water infrastructure was often very inadequate. And in most cities, the water utilities are not equipped. They're not going to be able to navigate or manage the kinds of issues that we're going to be facing. What kind of water take back are we doing? What kind of water recycling and reuse are we doing? How do you create a more circular water system, and how do you do that with renewable energy in order to fuel your water utility? And those are the opportunities that we're going to need to think about. How do municipalities finance that? It's a whole nother area where finance needs to be in. Effective finance for efficient water is going to be one of the most important functions a city is going to provide.
And do you think the lead or the push will come from the city planners, the urban planners, or is it going to come primarily from the financial sector, the investors, the bankers, who might look at this as an opportunity where we bundle projects, what we started with or we talked about earlier?
I hope we'll see more investors coming into the water space, and I think it's a great opportunity for public-private partnerships and collaboration. Often cities, though, are not able to take out loans. They have debt issues. They're not very highly rated. But that, again, I think we're talking about what are the metrics by which one judges an investment. And if we have ESG activities that can evaluate the social component, the performance on carbon, those kinds of metrics, if investors were tracking those, we would get a more diverse type of portfolio, even if we could look at sort of steady returns. Many ESCO projects are very, very well structured to provide steady returns.
Any thoughts on what countries or what regions might be doing better than others?
It depends on the parameters. I mean, there are areas of innovation in almost every country that I've worked in. Amazing things are happening. The NDCs are a great way to think about where and how countries are going to come forward with solutions, because they reflect the structure of their economies. It's not a one-size-fits-all. Every decarbonization plan, every just energy transition plan is going to look a little different, and the economic situation by country will be something that we have to use the UNFCCC to help guide us, because that's where countries are putting their plans. That's where the money is going to need to come from. This structure is incredibly important in order to have accountability, transparency, and participation that is very easy to track over time.
Sounds like, back to the theme of solutions, it's that you're suggesting that yes, there are solutions. Yes, there are things that are working, but clearly it's got to be a solution that's collaborative. Not just public and private sector, but urban planners and energy planners, the finance community, and those that are in charge of water utilities and energy systems. Where do we stand? And I'll try to frame it in the context of what I'm hearing, that there's a lot of concern about climate change related migration. Climate migrants, as that's the catchphrase. Where do you think we stand with that? I mean, clearly there are more climate-related episodes that are more frequent, more intense. impacts on the food systems, etc. Do you see that that's something that is happening at a pace that can be addressed and managed? What's your sense there?
This is, I think, something that I've not spent a lot of time studying, but certainly from the perspective of what would one expect in a world that is significantly impacted through multiple crises, food, water, and energy. And I think, and nature, right? The ecosystems that we are reliant on are at risk. The biodiversity loss, crop loss. There are a series of very worrying trends. And the people who are most vulnerable, if impacted, will have to do something to survive with their families. So I think we can absolutely recognize that those kinds of natural risks that because of a changing climate are going to drive people to migrate. And so what do we do? How do we then structure programming that doesn't come in at the disaster level, but instead comes in to help prepare people to weather those kinds of shifts? And that's the conversation on adaptation, on resilience that we need to have. That's where we need the investment. And we need to do it before the disaster happens.
So that's where your earlier comment about the appropriate parameters, appropriate metrics that needs to include some of this so that we don't wait for the disaster, but try and address things. So thank you very much. I thought this was a very useful feedback from you, and your observations were extremely, I think, very helpful and timely. So thanks
Thank you
again.
for having me.